Hello folks, welcome back. This is Chris in Central Pennsylvania with another update on this refugee situation for South Africans. On the 27th of June 2025, the Washington Post ran an article by Sylvia Foster-Frau that's entitled, Trump Officials Plan to Resettle 1,000 Afrikaners While Blocking Other Refugees. Now that's fake news, and I'll tell you why. Starts out saying refugees that a federal judge had ordered the Trump administration to admit are being barred from entry under the president's travel ban, even as Afrikaners are allowed in. Again, that's a lie. The Trump administration is ramping up its resettlement of white South Africans while simultaneously moving to bar entry for refugees from other countries that fall under the president's travel ban, according to a document reviewed by the Washington Post and a court filing. Now, that's misuse of information. It's also fake news. The refugee program for South Africans is not for white South Africans. It's for racial minorities, including coloreds and Indians. The U.S. Embassy website clearly states that, and that has been the case since the 12th of May. And this journalist, Ms. Foster-Frau, apparently is too busy to check on that or is intentionally misleading people because that has been up since the 12th of May. That's nearly 2 months ago. She continues, officials are moving to block refugees that a federal judge had ordered the administration to allow in after President Trump ground the refugee resettlement program to a halt, according to a Justice Department record submitted in a court proceeding. Well, that's selective reporting. Some Afghans have begun arriving in the United States in the month of June. This is after the freeze ended. But no mention of the Afghans that have been arriving here. She continues, the travel ban would also apply to the more than 12,000 refugees who had flights booked for the U.S. travel after February 3rd and who had a federal judge said must be allowed on a case-by-case basis under the appointment of a special master. Why? The law says nothing about the appointment of a special master for admitting refugees. That's not the role of a special master. Why is a special master involved here? This looks like more judicial overreach. Didn't we just settle this with a Supreme Court decision on Thursday? And she continues, thus far, only one group has been allowed to enter the United States as refugees under Trump. Afrikaners, the descendants of Dutch settlers. Again, that's a false statement. Afghans have also recently arrived in the United States. Also, more than Afrikaners have arrived. Coloreds also came over. In addition to that, Afrikaners are descendants of Dutch settlers? No. They're an admixture of German, Dutch, French, and oftentimes Khoi, San, and Asian as well. Calling them descendants of Dutch settlers is partially accurate. She continues, the president claims that they are facing racial discrimination and genocide, which she puts in quotes, an allegation that lacks any evidence. Well, that's simply a lie. There are over 145 laws denying equality under the law on the books in South Africa. Now, one can legitimately debate whether there is a genocide ongoing in South Africa. Any objective observer would freely admit nearly every step towards genocide that's internationally recognized has been surpassed. In South Africa, if it's not a genocide, it's certainly on the verge of one based on the indicators. Trump is trying to prevent one. She says a document reviewed by the Post states the administration plans to have resettled 1,000 white South Africans in the U.S. before the end of September. Now that's interesting, and I suspect very encouraging for South Africans who want to escape. But it does raise the question, who is breaking the law and sharing that information with the Washington Post? Also, why is the author demonically obsessed with saying white South Africans? They aren't white South Africans. They're South Africans suffering unjust racial oppression. That includes Indians and coloreds. Start telling the truth. The story continues. Refugee resettlement advocates question why the government is putting up roadblocks for a group of refugees that had been vetted and ordered by a judge to be admitted into the U.S. while clearing the way for others. Well, it's a fair question, but the answer was provided in the executive order pausing the program for 90 days. It's strange how the Post neglects to share that info. The reason, they do state later on part of it, but the reason why Trump isn't accepting vetted refugees is because of pervasive fraud under the Biden regime. President Trump froze those arrivals to determine if they were actually legitimate arrivals. Biden imported millions of people here and hundreds of thousands of people illegitimately under the refugee program who weren't properly vetted, and we can't prove who they were. Trump froze that to deal with the fraud. Now, to be fair, later in the article, the author does mention Trump's national security concerns, but that's not a highlight in reference to what's going on. It leaves the reader wondering what legitimate basis does Trump have for doing this? Well, he has a basis. Melissa Keeney, a senior attorney for the International Refugee Assistance Project, claims that the Trump administration simply doesn't want to process other refugee populations other than the white Afrikaner population. Again, this is race hustling, and that is an opinion, not a fact, something the Post neglects to share with their readers. That's her opinion, Melissa Keeney. That's not a fact. First off, she's factually wrong. It's not a white Afrikaner population. This is a racist narrative that's being published by the Washington Post and quoting this attorney who either doesn't know what she's talking about or is intentionally race hustling. Sad. Now, the author states that in mid-May, the first group of 49 Afrikaners arrived in the U.S. at Washington Dulles International Airport. No, it was 59. It wasn't 49. Now, folks, the only item of any value I can see in this article is the claim that the administration intends to move 1,000 South Africans by the end of the fiscal year on 30 September. That means that from today through the end of the fiscal year, in 3 months, roughly 12 South Africans per day will arrive in the United States before the end of the fiscal year. Every day, 11 or 12 South Africans will arrive here. Now, that's interesting. The intent of this article appears not to be to inform the public, but rather to stir racial animosity with its false mention of Afrikaners and whites, falsely implying and outright stating that white South Africans are the beneficiaries of this when all racial minorities are the beneficiaries. Also because the author's structure in the article emphasizes opinions over facts and is pulling at the heartstrings. Folks, this article in the Washington Post, while it's encouraging potentially for South Africans interested in the refugee program, it appears to be much more about attacking Donald Trump than informing the public. And what say you? That's what I have to say about it. Cheers.